Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to welcome you today to our Climate Forward, Navigating the Politics of Climate Change conference. I'd like to kick things off by recognizing our conference hosts, the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future, the USC Dornsife Wrigley Institute for Environmental Studies, and the USC Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy. Thanks to Hope Warshaw for her steadfast support of our program. And we are grateful this morning to the generous support of our corporate sponsor, Clean Energy, and its CEO, Andrew Littlefair. Andrew is a member of our Wrigley Advisory Board, and his gift to Wrigley enabled us to bring together our campus partners for this event this morning. So thank you, Andrew. There were a lot of folks who did so much work behind the scenes to make today possible. In particular, I'd like to thank our director of the Center for the Political Future, Professor Bob Shrum, who many of you know is an extremely accomplished Democratic strategist. And of course, his frenemy, the co-director Mike Murphy, who is an equally accomplished Republican strategist. Also, Ali Bissonnette and Erica Maldonado-Singh at the Center for the Political Future, as well as Ken Nielsen and Jessica Dutton from the Wrigley Institute. We appreciate all that all of you have done to pull this tremendous event together this morning. Today's subject is a personal one for me. I grew up in Decker Canyon in the Santa Monica Mountains, where I spent most of my childhood outdoors, building forts and playing in the creek. With all of my sanctioned pets, not to mention the small mammals, birds, insects, and amphibians I brought home, my dad used to say he felt like Dr. Dolittle. It's impossible to grow up in that way and not appreciate the importance of the natural beauty in our world and the importance of preserving it. The house that I grew up in turned 100 years old last year. My dad still owns the property, but I hadn't been there in 20 years, and I brought my family there to see it for the first time last October. And then 12 days later, it burned down to the ground in the Woolsey fire. The increasing incidence of these fires, not just in California, but around the world, is just one direct effect of a warming planet. Last October, the United Nations Climate Science Organization said we have only about 10 or 20 years at our current trajectory before climate change brings about worsening food shortages, inundated coastlines, and mass die-offs of coral reefs. For a child born in America today, all of this could happen before they even have the right to vote. The weight is squarely on us to transform our behaviors and safeguard our planet for future generations. There are scientific questions, but climate change is not a question of science. It is a question of politics, of policy, and of our societal capacity to respond before it's too late. We are not here today to debate whether or not climate change is happening. We are here today to talk about how to break the political roadblocks that are preventing more meaningful action. It's unfortunate that one of the biggest challenges we still face, at least at the national scale, is simply talking about climate change. We can get a sense of why this might be when we hear the way that our politicians today put more emphasis on attacking each other than on attacking our critical problems. This is what our new USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future is all about. Here we are putting partisan politics aside to discuss real issues and actually get things done. Rather than starting our conversations with, as Mike Murphy puts it, "I'm right and you're evil," the center starts by establishing a common set of facts and a commitment to civil discourse. Folks with very different political ideologies are talking through difficult problems, like climate change, and they're not even wringing each other's necks. With a productive framework for conversation, we tap the experts at USC Dornsife, as well as leaders outside the university, who can help inform solutions. Not just our natural scientists, but our political scientists, economists, sociologists, psychologists, spatial scientists, writers, and many others who can help us make inroads. Our goal is to ensure that solutions are informed by the best evidence and problem-solving methods available. But we can't adequately address these issues without reaching beyond our walls. We need to connect with policymakers and business leaders who implement solutions. And that's what our new Academy in the Public Square initiative is all about. And with a problem as urgent as climate change, we also need people who know how to tell the story in a way that motivates individuals and communities. We need people who are willing to take a stand, not just when it's the popular thing to do, but when it's the right thing to do. We are fortunate to kick off this morning with someone who does just that. USC is pleased to welcome the Honorable John Kerry. Following 28 years of service in the pressure cooker of the U.S. Senate, John Kerry served as the 68th Secretary of State. He is a decorated Navy veteran who was awarded numerous combat medals, including the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and 3 Purple Hearts. Today, he is one of the leading public proponents of climate change action, but he was also one of the earliest to take this message into the political trenches. Kerry has been in the fight to protect our planet since the first Earth Day in 1970, and he has since participated in practically every major climate conference and UN climate meeting in the past 30 years. As Secretary of State, he was instrumental in securing the 2014 US-China deal, in which China agreed to significant carbon reductions. That deal helped break the bottleneck in UN climate negotiations and set the stage for the Paris Climate Accord. As many of you know, Kerry was the leading architect for this critical international agreement. John Kerry once said, "Logic screams out to us that no country can plausibly claim to be a global leader if it fails to lead on climate change." The same can be said for universities. USC Dornsife cannot be a global leader if we aren't on the forefront of solving this problem. Today, we have the opportunity for a productive and engaging conversation about climate policy from a number of different perspectives. And there's no one better to start us off than the Honorable John Kerry. Please welcome him to the stage.
Thank you, USC. Thank you all very, very much. And I'm delighted to be here. Truth be told, after 28 years in the United States Senate, I'm delighted to be invited anywhere, folks. So I'm happy to be standing here. Dean Miller, thank you very, very much. I appreciate your welcome and your sound introduction to the talk that we're going to have today, both the conversation that I'm about to have a few minutes later after I share some opening comments with everybody. Dean Miller, as many of you may know, took a class way back when, as a freshman in college, on black holes in space. And that means that she is indeed an expert on the darkest regions of the universe where the gravitational pull is so great that neither light nor life can escape, which reminds me of Washington, D.C. I don't know about the rest of you. But Dean Miller is not just a subject matter expert. She is a leading experimental cosmologist who has made her mission to build bridges, and you heard her talking about building bridges in the context of her introduction. Bridges between the world of science and the rest of us. And I'm not just referring to her class, Physics for Poets. It's a much broader discipline than that and critical at this moment, this ability to bring people together to build consensus. So I'm very, very grateful for her leadership at USC Dornsife and for helping to inspire the next generation of citizens. Robert Kennedy called the word citizen a title of honor. And the person who actually invited me here today has lived that title, unlike too many of our citizens who don't. Bob Shrum's political resume is not just a list of jobs and positions. It's really a declaration of principle. And it speaks volumes to a life of purpose in which he has made an enormous difference and continues to as a citizen of conviction and of conscience. So I want to thank him personally. In 1980, as the fight over the Democratic platform grew ever louder, both sides were arguing with passion, and Bob was arguing that it should include support for gay rights. It was a tough time back then. I can tell you when I ran for president in 2004, it was still a tough issue. We have made amazing transformation, but back in 1980, it was a big fight. And Bob won that fight, That year, for the first time, the platform did exactly what he set out to do, which is recognize it. With Ted Kennedy, with Bob, with his wife, Mary Louise, with Otzi, he proved that we were ready to reinvigorate our ability to move towards a democracy with inclusion and justice, not just for some, but for all. And Bob particularly knew that we the people really means all the people. And that is more relevant today, perhaps, than even then. So I thank him. I thank Bob for helping to work me through and prep me for my debates. It is said that I won all three of them. I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened in Ohio, folks. But Bob was a key part of that great effort. And I really do thank him for his leadership, and I thank him for his friendship. I also want to thank, I think Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of Britain, is here. And I was privileged to work with him when he was both Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister. A very, very thoughtful public person who did not get the full number of years I think many of us thought he should have as Prime Minister. But I'm glad that he's here lecturing and teaching, and his is the kind of voice we need to hear more in the public discourse. Now, my friends, I did not come here to be partisan or political or pessimistic. But let me be clear, I did come here to tell the truth. And with the election season upon us, one truth is irrefutable. It is imperative that the United States of America gets a president of the United States who believes in and understands the science of climate change and is prepared to do something about it. And it is equally important actually, it's equally important that we have a president who actually understands basic science. I want you to think about it for a minute. I mean, during World War II, America would have never tolerated a president who denied Hitler's aggression. During the Cold War, America would have never accepted a commander-in-chief who refused to have a policy that would counter the Soviet Union. And after 9/11, we never would have been willing to accept a president of the United States who wasn't able to admit that it was Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda who knocked down the Twin Towers. Facts are facts. And here we are in 2019 with a level of impunity that is absolutely astounding to me. Politicians who call climate change a hoax and campaign on policies that will make the reality of climate change even worse. Well, I want to come here to this conference, which is an important conference, and declare as firmly as I can, despite what the dean said about the imperative, we've got to have a conversation. Yes, we have to have a conversation. But we have to have a conversation about reality. We have to have a conversation that's based on facts. And in America today, it's harder and harder to find that factual consensus. And believe me, in a democracy, if you cannot establish what the baseline facts are, it is nearly impossible in this multi-platformed media world to build the consensus necessary to make decisions. And that's why President Putin and President Xi are busy running around the world, offering a different narrative, a narrative that should concern every single American, a narrative that says that the liberal order of the West that was built after World War II is dead, and that the United States of America is in decline. I've heard those words from both of them and from their acolytes. So enough is enough. The world, and certainly the United States, have got to break out of this very strange and dangerous place that we are in. And there is no way to meet the challenge of our time, in time, unless we create political accountability for those in positions of power who are not exercising that power on behalf of common sense and the future. Now that's why we're gathered here for this conference at the University of Southern California. Not as an exercise to talk and have a nice speech or not, as the case may be, but as an exhortation to act. Today, more and more people all over the world are beginning to clamor for reaction to climate change, for some kind of response. And those in positions, responsibility globally, have a fundamental responsibility to lead the way towards progress. That's what leadership is supposed to be about. And the reason for that is simple. For 2 decades now, if not more, for 3, 4. I mean, I began this journey back in the 1980s when we dealt with acid rain and had a response in the context of the Clean Air Act, and when I went to the Senate. I've been part of that ever since 1988 when Jim Hansen testified to us, global climate change is happening, and it's happening now, 1988. In 1992, when we went to Rio for the Earth Summit, and so on, Kyoto, on to Copenhagen's failure, ultimately, and then finally to Paris. So I know this. I know the arguments, I know the facts, I know the issues, I know the procrastination, I know the lies, and I know the dangers. And increasingly, so do you. The science has been screaming at us, warning us, compelling us to act. And climate change is going to impact every single nation on the earth and every sector of the global economy, and it already is in many places. And as we careen towards irreversible environmental tipping points, we have no time to waste debating alternative facts fabricated by ideological zealots, only to be enforced to invest years down the road, just trying to reestablish trust in the real facts. So in Paris, we set a goal. The goal was not our goal. It wasn't a political goal. It's not something that we grabbed out of the sky and said, hey, here's a target. We did what the scientists told us we needed to do in order to avoid the greatest tipping point, where things began to unravel in an ecosystem that you can't control, that we don't even understand the full downstream impacts of. But we know there is a tipping point somewhere. The ocean is the greatest sink, as we call it, takes in carbon dioxide. Most of the warmth that comes from the sun and the earth goes into the ocean. But we now have had evidence in certain places, Antarctica for one, of the regurgitation of carbon dioxide from the ocean. The ocean spitting it back, saying, hey, I'm full, I can't eat anymore. We don't know exactly where that is. We don't know if that's everywhere in the ocean. But if you're a practical, thoughtful person, particularly in a public position of responsibility, you ought to step back and begin to think about, how do I execute the basic principle of prudence, of judgment, about how we plan for the future. We decided in Paris that we would have an aspirational goal of 1.5% degrees of allowable increase in the Earth's temperature from pre-industrial levels, aspirational, with a view that 2 degrees centigrade is manageable. And if we target 2 degrees, we probably get where we need to without catastrophe. And we did not leave Paris. I said this to the plenary session after the celebration of achieving this 196 country agreement. I said, we are not leaving here knowing that we can tell the world that we are guaranteeing we're holding the Earth's temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade, because nothing that's in the Paris Agreement will actually guarantee that. What we were leaving Paris doing and feeling proud about was sending a message, unprecedented message, to the marketplace, to the private sector. Hey guys, 196 countries are all going to try to reduce their emissions, all simultaneously responding to this great challenge. And It's open for business. It's the biggest market the world has ever seen or known. I mean, the market of the 1990s, when people got very rich in Massachusetts and California and places, was a tech market. It was a $1 trillion market with 1 billion users. The energy market today is a market of 4 to 5 billion users. It's going to go up to 9 billion in the next 30 years. There are a billion people without any electricity. It's already a multi-trillion-dollar market. We're looking at the greatest market opportunity the world's ever known, and we're not moving towards it because we don't have the incentives built into our economy to do it. We don't have the leadership crying for people to do it. We don't have the push for technology, research, and development the way we ought to be, marginally here and there. We're not taking it seriously. Some people are. Some companies are doing brilliant stuff. Some researchers are. But as a society, as a government, as a leader of the world, we're not taking this seriously enough. And people need to understand. People are dying today, and more people will die because of the effects of climate change. And billions of dollars of damage is being done today, and trillions will be done over the next years if we don't move faster. Today, by acts of omission and commission, we are literally walking like lemmings over that cliff. We are unwittingly signed on to a mutual suicide pact because politicians are not responding or being held accountable for mocking the fact of what is happening and those who are advocating to do something about it. And the evidence is impossible to miss, my friends. You know, right here in California, Dean Miller mentioned it a moment ago, 15 of the biggest fires in California history occurred in the last 18 years. Why more fires? Well, because there's more growth of underbrush, among other things, more moisture coming out of a warmer ocean, more intensity to the winds, more intensity to the storms, and more flash flooding in places which normally don't grow things, but now they do, and it burns. The costs of just that were staggering. 1.8 million acres of fire, $3 billion spent on the cleanup. Greenland, I went up to Greenland as Secretary of State with my friend, the foreign minister from Norway, and we went up above the Arctic Circle and went to Svalbard and looked at what's happening in the glaciers. I flew over a glacier and see the calving, 86 million metric tons of ice breaking off every single day and floating out to sea to melt. Now, the ice in Greenland is on rock. It's not displacing water, the oceans today. It's rock. So every drop of water that goes on is an add-on to the water of the oceans. 86 million metric tons of ice a day is the equivalent of all the water that greater New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey would use for an entire year. Hurricanes Maria, Harvey, Irma. Look at the devastation of Puerto Rico. Hurricane Irma is the first hurricane ever recorded with sustained winds for 24 hours of 185 miles an hour. And Harvey dropped in 5 days on Houston more water than goes over Niagara Falls in an entire year. It's supposed to be a once in a 50,000 year storm. The problem is the once in 500 year storms, the once in 50,000 year storms, the once in whatever, are happening with greater frequency. We measure them in our lifetimes, not in thousands of years. So historic droughts are now matched by historic floods. Heat waves stole 153 billion hours of labor globally in 2017. Infectious diseases are now moving into new areas at higher altitudes. Just yesterday in the New York Times, an article about people moving out of Honduras. They can't live anymore in the mountains. One of the things contributing to the refugee crunch. Crop yields are down in more than 24 countries by 2050. The Midwestern United States could see agricultural productivity dropped to the lowest level in decades. And this is just a preview of what's going to come. Everything I've just told you, not a surprise to those of us who started this in 1988, because the scientists predicted this. Al Gore wrote a book about it, did a movie about it. Everybody knows this is coming at us, but we don't act. We sit around indulgently doing everything else other than facing the truth and doing the things that we could do. The government panel, the intergovernmental panel with the world's best scientists who dedicate their lives to finding the truth, have told us that if we don't take unprecedented historic steps over the course of the next few years, 12 years, the next 0.5 degree increase could be absolutely catastrophic. That brings you to 1.5. You get to 2 degrees, you're talking about a whole new ballgame. No documented historic precedent. That's what we have to achieve, according to the scientists. But every day we lose ground debating alternative facts when climate change is not a he said, she said issue. I mean, 2 and 2 is 4, 4 and 4 is 8. We have tables that can predict where the sun is going to rise in a year, 2 years, to the millisecond. We know these things, just as we know what is happening because of the thing called greenhouse gas and its effect. Even the Trump administration's own recently congressionally mandated climate assessment says, quote, with continued growth in emissions at historic rates, annual losses in some economic sectors are projected to reach hundreds of billions of dollars by the end of the century, more than the current gross domestic product of many U.S. states. So this moment, my friends, this election cycle, these next few months and years, they need to be action-forcing moments for renewed global focus. According to one recent estimate, the world's top 3 emitters, China, the EU, and the United States, we produce about 15% of emissions. China is about 25%, EU is about 9+. So that's over 50%, just 3 of us on this planet. Think of what happens when the G20 meets and you could get a G20 movement where the major emitters are providing more than 80, 85% of all the emissions. Think of what could happen if you had leadership there and make it happen. The statistics regarding the lower 130 countries that produce less than 1%, no wonder they're shocked. No wonder they're angry at us. No wonder they wonder about the Green Climate Fund, where in Paris we committed to put $100 billion on the table in order to help provide technology to small countries to transition so they could leapfrog technology, not make the mistakes developed countries made. And you know how much money's in that fund today? $5 billion is now sort of, I guess, been decided where it's going, but it hasn't even gone yet. So, to compound that, the United States, which led the effort, I went to China and I negotiated with President Xi to try to break the deadlock of Copenhagen, and I succeeded with President Xi in getting us to work together for the first time so that 1 year later, President Xi and President Obama could stand up in Beijing and announce the intended reductions of both of our countries. It had a catalyzing effect. Europe followed, other countries. That's how we got Paris done, by leading, laying the groundwork. Instead, President Trump's administration is on track to unleash more emissions by replacing the Clean Power Plan with a rule that would allow power plants to unload 12 times more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Instead of controlling fuel emissions, the administration is rolling back fuel economy standards that the auto industry has embraced and achieved. Here in California, you do the best job of anywhere. Instead of keeping a lid on methane, the administration is making more likely that this problem, this potent greenhouse gas, 20 times more damaging than carbon dioxide, although it eventually melts away, which carbon dioxide doesn't do, but nevertheless, 20 times more damaging while it's in its potency. It's going to leak into the atmosphere because of the tundra and the permafrost now thawing, and you can go in the oceans. There's a movie coming out soon which is going to show, I think it's called Ice on Fire. It's going to show what is happening with respect to methane. You could light a match on the ocean and see poof, flame, where the bubbling up methane is coming. So you don't have to be a scientist or a leader of government to understand that the reason all of you are here, all of us are here today, isn't just to have a nice time for a morning chat at USC. It's because time is running out. Climate change itself is changing the basic chemistry of the oceans. I started the oceans conferences at the State Department. We had 4 of them, 5 of them now. And I'm proud to tell you that what we began at the State Department in 2014 has now been in 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19. This year it will be in Norway. After last year in Bali, we've got $10 billion raised. We're creating marine protected areas, but it's not happening fast enough either. And the basic chemistry of the ocean is changing faster than it has in 50 million years. Oceans are warming 40% faster than ever before. And this warming is threatening marine life, some of which is just going to die out. It can no longer survive in the very waters that have nourished it since time began. In fact, scientists estimate that species around the world are dying out at more than 1,000 times the natural rate. We're killing species every day. And there are more than 500 dead zones throughout the ocean, places where nothing lives because of the nitrate and pesticide and other overflow that comes out of the Missouri River or the Ohio River into the Mississippi, out into the front. That's one example. There are 500 of them around the world. So these are the facts that are playing out every day for everybody to see. Obviously, we've seen the Midwest particularly hard hit in these last days. So you know what, folks? Let's get serious. We need to mobilize. We need to get angry. We need to hold politicians accountable. We need to make climate change a voting issue, which is how you will actually accelerate everything that today is not happening. All the science says that mankind is contributing to this problem. The bright side of that is that because it's man-made, mankind can solve the problem. I'm actually an optimist about this. I believe we can solve the problem. It's not a matter of waiting for some discovery, though there are discoveries to be made. It's a matter of having the willpower to make the decisions to do the things that we know will make a difference. We can restore the health of our ocean. We can exceed our commitments under the Paris Accords. And we can do what scientists and science tells us we have no choice but to do. The question is this: will we? It's the only question right now. Are we going to continue to sit around knowing that we're heading towards disaster, or will we make the choices that are available to us? Now, I got to tell you, my friends, future generations, if they're lucky enough to survive all of this, are going to measure us not just by what we debated or whether we noted or acted on the facts. The verdict is going to hang on whether or not we put in place the policies that actually save us from what we know is coming at us. And every day that goes by that we're paralyzed and don't act is a day in the future that our grandchildren are going to suffer and pay for it. That's not hyperbole. That's science. So what do we do? I'm not just going to come here and give you an array of what's the reality of this challenge, though I want you to understand the reality of this challenge deeply in your gut and heart as well as your head, because we have to act. But we can change. We can change. I talked about the greatest market the world has ever seen. Some people are investing in it and moving towards it. It's just that it's not happening fast enough. That's the problem. There was a Saudi oil minister who said the Stone Age did not end for lack of stones. And the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil. He obviously was banking on people being wise and making decisions they need to make. So we know that this Congress is not going to send a serious piece of legislation to the president. We know they're not going to force him to say no to deploying solar technology that could actually turn the American West into the Saudi Arabia of solar. We know that they're not going to be willing to force him to say no to turning on the Midwest into the Middle East of wind power. And we know that they're not ready to challenge him to create a manufacturing revolution that could put West Virginia back to work in ways that his beloved coal never will. Senator Shrum is right to demand that infrastructure legislation actually hasten the transition to clean energy and increase climate resilience. So how are we going to do these things that we know we have to do? Well, my confidence about the future comes from experience. What we have to do is go back and do what we did once before, some of us, who unfortunately have gotten gray in the process. We did something before we even had an environmental movement in this country. When I first came back from Vietnam in 1969, the first thing that I did was turn my attention to what had inspired me while I was at college from 62 to 66. In 63, Rachel Carson wrote The Silent Spring, touched America. And in 1970, when I was just back, I joined in the effort in Massachusetts to organize Earth Day. It was an eye-opening immersion into the power of grassroots to force a problem onto the national radar screen and demand action. We brought 20 million Americans out of their homes on one single day, but we didn't stop with that. We took those 20 million Americans and converted them into the instruments of political action. We targeted the 12 worst votes in the United States Congress. We labeled them the Dirty Dozen. And in the 1972 election, we defeated 7 of the 12. Let me tell you, from my experience as an elected public official for 28 years plus, there is nothing like watching your colleagues around you lose and knowing why they're losing to stiffen your spine. And that's what happened. Within a span of time, short, year and a half, 2 years, we passed the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act. We actually put in place something called the Environmental Protection Agency. America didn't even have one until the people came out and demanded it. Well, I got news for you folks. We still live in a democracy. And anybody can go out and organize. Anybody can go out and stand on a soapbox, say what they want to say. Anybody can work to accomplish any legitimate goal. And what we need to do in the United States of America is make our democracy work again. And we need to do it around this issue above all. Hold people accountable. Now, I'm not going to come here and just give you some loosey-goosey, bromides that tell you how bad it is here or what we got to do. Here's what we need to organize around. These are some of the things we should do. First of all, the solution to climate change is, as I said, energy policy. How we produce our electricity, how we transport ourselves, how we build our buildings, how industry functions, how it powers its machinery. All of these things are the stuff of energy production. And what we need to do is perhaps the first and the most important thing of all we ought to do, and it's the biggest thing in my judgment in terms of America's DNA. Our DNA is discovery. We're the country that invented the internet, which, by the way, we didn't do for private sector. It was a government purpose, funded by the government. It was to be able to actually communicate in the context of a nuclear war. And Bolt, Beranek, Newman in Massachusetts and Route 495 produced this, and all of a sudden, they said, all right, we got to make something commercial out of this. And off we went. Same thing that happened through the space race. Look at all the things we have, like convection ovens you run the list of kitchen appliances and different things that came out of the space program. It's extraordinary. Well, guess what? We can do that again here. We need to build incentives into our economy that make it attractive for people to take risk and push the curve of discovery. Hydrogen. may become a major fuel, may be the ability to turn things quickly. It's got to be brought up to scale. It's flammable. It's got problems. But there are hydrogen vehicles driving around today. And maybe we can get there faster. Battery storage could change the entire dynamic for solar, reduce the need for fossil fuel dependency for base load maintenance, because you don't want your economy to shut down. So you need to have a capacity to sustain when you don't have the sun and you don't have the wind. Those arguments are legitimate. And we have to respond to them with real answers. So we need to build these incentives. We need to vastly increase our commitment to something called mission innovation. We put mission innovation together in the context of the Paris Agreement. Prime Minister Modi of India, President Xi, China, President Obama, all joined together. 23 nations signed on to mission innovation, and Europe. Another 28 still today, until British figure out what they're doing. So that's a lot of countries, all of them developed, all of them able to move the economy of the world. So if we would begin to fund in the trillions of dollars the energy, every university ought to be chasing this more than they are even today. I know you're doing a lot, but this has to become the holy grail of day-to-day life in terms of the future economies of our country. We need to increase energy efficiency. The biggest, lowest hanging fruit to reduce emissions is in efficiency. Efficiency in buildings, efficiency in automobiles, and so forth. Industrial and residential sectors. We need to implement creative ways of managing pollution and runoff from agriculture. We need to provide incentives and assistance to industry to transition from high-intensity carbon production to no net carbon production. And success is not going to come sitting around a table in Paris. It's going to come from leadership in every single country. One of the most powerful ways that we can change behavior is through carbon pricing. The idea is pretty straightforward. It's the clearest signal we could send to the marketplace. It will have the greatest, fastest impact, because it allows people to make their own decisions. You decide how you want to spend your money. Decide what you want to do. But I got news for you. Consumers will begin to demand, and companies will move to meet that demand, because that's how you make money. And importantly, we have to do this in a way that low-income and middle-income people do not carry the burden the way non-thinking has forced people to carry the burden in this country. So, as I said earlier, this is not a place for partisanship. It is a place to tell the truth, and sometimes that nudges up to that line, I know, when you have incomprehensible decisions coming out of zero process. It's hard not to get dragged over that line. But I got news for you. None of those storms I talked about have an R or a D after their name. I also said this is a place for truth. I regret more than I can say that America, our country, normally the world's leader on moral issues, went from leading on climate change to leading on a denier's chorus. But even here, there is a positive side, probably unknown to our current president. Even before the Trump administration walked away from Paris, 29 U.S. states, including California, passed renewable portfolio laws. That required them to move in the direction of alternative renewable fuel. Another 8 adopted voluntary renewable standards. So in total, 37 states, representing 80% of the population of the United States of America, are moving in the direction of Paris and trying to do it. It's patently evident that the president may have pulled out of Paris, but I'm proud to tell you the American people are still in the Paris Agreement and are going to meet its targets by themselves. Now, I think the world and a lot of companies have assumed responsibility for this. What they need is a president who will summon the Fortune 500 companies to the White House and sit them down for a day, go through the charts, show them what's happening, offer them the alternatives of what we could do, and then get their support to work into our economic system tax benefits that actually go to the people who are going to discover the solution, not just tax credits and tax cuts that go to billionaires who are the last people in our country, given the inequity we have today, when 51% of America's income is going to 1% of Americans. We have an unsustainable political equation we're living by. That has to change as part of this revolution, and I think it will. Shell announced that it's quitting the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers Association industry. And why? Because of the industry's lack of support for sensible climate policies. Shell and other major giants are recognizing that coal is becoming more expensive. It's actually more expensive today than solar. And what we need to do is recognize that, despite, yes, there are some challenges still with solar, but we can fix those challenges by driving the technology curve. One recent analysis found that solar went down in price 88% since 2009. Wind is down 69%. Coal's gone up 9%. And meanwhile, another study found that more than 40% of coal power plants globally are facing losses. Now, I firmly believe that we're just getting started here, folks. But I think the marketplace has made its decision fundamentally. What we need to do now is make sure that we are advancing, as India is, for instance. India is going to install 100 gigawatts of solar capacity by 2020. The problem is they've also got a bunch of coal-fired power plants coming online. We have to try to push them to do more. President Xi Jinping announced $360 billion is going into their clean energy research right away. U.S. oil and gas companies were imploring the president to stay committed to Paris. Major Fortune 500 companies were trying to get the president to stay in, and he refused to. So I have no doubt we will get to a low-carbon, no-carbon economy someday. But we don't have a someday goal here. We have to get there in time to prevent that tipping point ecosystem unraveling that none of us know enough about not to exercise the precautionary principle to implement. The question I have is not whether we're going to get there, but whether we will get there in time. So as I said earlier, energy demand is going to double in the next years. We're on course today to hit 4 to 4.5 degrees centigrade, which is destructive. So will we make the transition? We can only make the transition if we do what I described by creating political accountability. In 2016, we elected a president with 54.2% of eligible voters deciding to come out and vote. 54.2%. You think we have a problem today? Think about that. When Obama won in 2008, the turnout was 62 or 3%, 0.5. When I ran against Bush in 2004, it was 60.3% turnout. That difference, 9% of Obama's vote voted for Trump. And 6% of Obama's vote didn't come out and vote at all. That's 15% of Obama's vote didn't even show up. In this midterm election, we had a youth vote that went from 19% to 31%. Hey, great, it went up. You're right to applaud because it went up, but it still means that 69% of young people who have the greatest stake of all in the future didn't choose to vote. That's unacceptable. And we have to blame the politicians, blame the people who are turning people off of the system, blame the people who are not giving people a vision of what we can really do to build our economy and change the future. So nothing of this is impossible. Nothing. You know, the great Muhammad Ali said, impossible is just a big word that's thrown around by small men who find it easier to live in the world that they've been given than to explore the power that they have to change it. Impossible is not a fact. It's an opinion. Impossible is not a declaration. It's a dare. So meeting this challenge is about daring. And it will not happen, my friends, unless every single one of you dare to take on this task over this next at least year and a half into 2020. So we have more Americans willing to take stake in their democracy because they see a vision around which we can organize our lives. It's about leading our planet towards a future of prosperity and peace and better alternatives. And I got to tell you something. I've sat on the Foreign Relations Committee for 28 years. I was chairman of it, and I was Secretary of State. I've been in every security briefing there is, and I understand what the nature of threats are. Cyber is a completely also unmet threat at this point in time. And nuclear, with the INF Treaty and START Treaty being shredded by this administration, is going to be a challenge going forward. But you know what? What we've just talked about, is above those in terms of its immediate impact, its cost, and absolute reality that it's happening. Maybe we won't have a cyber. Maybe we won't have a nuclear event. But we are having the climate event. And so every single one of you has to dare to take on the title of honor of citizen. Please, let's get it done. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much for those terrific, sobering, yet inspiring comments. We really appreciate it. We're going to continue this conversation by bringing up Professor Bob Shrum, who will guide our question and answer session. Professor Shrum worked for decades in the DC trenches as a strategist and consultant for a number of high-level political campaigns and administrations, including John Kerry's campaign in 2004. Professor Shrum is now the Carmen and Lewis Warshaw Chair in Practical Politics and Professor of the Practice of Political Science at USC Dornsife. He is the founding director of our new Center for the Political Future, having successfully led and expanded our Unruh Institute of Politics over the past 2 years. He is also a beloved teacher here at USC Dornsife and a dear friend of mine. Please welcome Professor Bob Shrum.
So that was a very powerful opening, and I'm going to try first to say, I can't say it adequately enough, thank you for coming, and thank you for what is almost now, at a personal level for me, almost 50 years of friendship. I'm going to begin with the question that goes to the heart of something you were talking about. You were talking about the 2020 election. And because we both know from personal experience in 2004, and it was true in other years as well, from 2000 through 2016, climate didn't seem to be a big motivating issue for voters. I sense that that's changing, and that it will change in 2020. Do you agree with that, and why has it happened? Why couldn't we get there before? Why are we getting there now?
Well, I think people are beginning to see, Bob, the effects. I mean, you know, with the fires out here, the storms, the Midwest. Unfortunately, we've had to wait for this sort of reality check that jolts people a little bit. I think you're right that there's a potential for it, but I think it's going to take major leadership and major push to summon the kinds of numbers that are going to create the accountability that I talked about. And that has to happen.
So, you know, we're going to talk today about what can be done at the national level, the international level, what states and cities and the private sector can do. You mentioned the first Earth Day and 20 million Americans pouring out into the streets to demand action. What can individual citizens do now? How can the public bend the arc of policy?
Well, multiple levels, obviously. I mean, for a number of years in the context of environment, there was this saying about, you know, think globally, act locally. And a lot of people did, you know, different things. You kind of pull it all together. There's an amazing amount happening now. More than, I mean, this is I kept saying, I don't want to denigrate. I mean, we got more than 1,200 mayors in America who have signed on to the Paris standards and who are working to change things. We have the 38 states I talked about, the governors in those states. The problem is none of them can get the job done alone, even in an aggregate. If America went to zero emissions tomorrow, the problem is not solved. I mean, I did describe to you how those three entities equal just over 50%. But when you see the other side of that coin, the rest of the 189 countries or so equal 49% or whatever it is. And therefore, the problem remains with us. And I had this argument with the Chinese. I kept saying that. I said, well, we're going to lower our intensity. And I said, Mr. President, it's not your intensity that is going to make the difference. It's the amount, the tonnage of CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere. And even though your intensity may go down, your net amount of tonnage could undo everything that any other country is doing if you don't change it. So we have to get on the same measurement scale. So there are things to do globally, things to do locally. You said, what can people do? Well, first of all, there's no one in America should not be ready to go vote. I was privileged to be an observer at elections in Sudan, South Sudan, in Kenya, in the Philippines, in Palestine territories over the years. And I saw people go out and wait 15 hours in a boiling hot 110, 120 degree sun with people with machine guns and tanks and possibility of bombs going off all around them. And they voted. And boy, were they excited. I went up to one guy in Sudan and I apologized for the long lines. And he said to me, you know, you don't have to apologize. I've waited 50 years for this vote. I'm going to wait for whatever time it takes. We have to respect the vote here in America more and be willing to take part and hold people accountable. And I'm convinced there's a massive majority in America to do what makes sense. But we have to summon it. If they just think it's Tweedledee-dum and Tweedledee-dee running against each other, we got a problem. What else can you do? You can join any number of groups locally. A group of us are thinking about putting together a website where we are a clearinghouse for everything that's happening out there. And people can come and say, well, what's going to happen in this town? What's happening? What's the state doing? What are the difficulties? Make your own choices. I mean, in a world of Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat and whatever, we should not have a problem communicating to each other and being able to build the kind of crowd support for this, both financially and in votes, that I think can make the difference. We have to put that to the test.
Can we do an Earth Day on the internet?
Well, I think you got to do more than that. I think Earth Day will be part of this. I've worked in Earth Day for years since. I managed the New England 1990 20th anniversary. Dennis Hayes has been a terrific leader in it for years. Earth Day is going to continue. It's its 50th anniversary next year. So that'll be part of it, but I don't think it's the whole thing. I think we've got to have more organized efforts locally. Plastic. Kids in schools. Every school could adopt a beach or adopt a park or adopt a road. People could figure out how to, we ought to get plastic bags out of supermarkets. And we ought to make it easier for the supermarket owners to be able to afford to do it by having some structure that provides big shopping bags, canvas, long-lasting, that people can take. And here's a better choice for you. Just bring it back next time so you use it. I mean, there are plenty of things we can do. If we keep going where we're going with plastic, we're going to have more plastic in the ocean than fish by 2040. We've just got to begin to make changes. How does it come? Citizens can affect purchasing patterns. If a community begins to push back against irresponsible practices by particular product creators and sellers, that will change things. It's activism that changes things. I'm a huge believer in that. You know, back in the night, I'm not a believer that everything we did in the 1960s was perfect by any means. We had a lot of excesses and we made a lot of mistakes, but I'll tell you this, we sent students down from my university to Mississippi and Alabama, and we were part of the Mississippi voter registration drive, and we broke the back of Jim Crow. We got a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act. We had vast movement for women because we activated and we began to break the glass ceiling. It's not broken completely, but we made gains in employment, in Title IX, and a whole bunch of things. That came from student activism. Young people, by and large, are the people who, at least in that period of time, made the greatest changes. We ended the war in Vietnam. It took too long, but we did it.
I want to ask you one other question, and that's about the the UN governmental report on climate change, which you mentioned that we have just 12 years before we run the risk of climate catastrophe. What are the priorities for those 12 years? I mean, what are the big things we have to do?
Fastest thing we could do right now is, as I said, I do carbon pricing, I do the mission innovation in a huge amount so that we can, someone's going to be the next Sergey Brin, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, whatever, and come up with a new technology, a new fuel, a better battery, longer storage, faster transmission. We're going to, I mean, it just is the nature of the beast, Moore's Law. We are going to do it. We've just got to push it so that we have, like the Manhattan Project or Moonshot. We've got to have a goal in mind because we're kind of fighting a war, and we have to win. That's the way we ought to go at it. And I have confidence in American ingenuity and our scientific base, and we ought to work in a consortium with China, with Europeans. And I know the Chinese are perfectly happy to do that. We could be doing that and sharing technology and sharing effort. That's the second. The third is moving towards electricity production from clean sources. We've got to, we cannot, I mean, most of the coal-fired power plants are being phased out now. In America, you can't fund a coal-fired plant, but in India, you have 250 megawatts of power coming online through coal shortly. You got 25 coal-fired power plants planned for Vietnam. I'm trying to get them not to do that and shift them into a different modality. India is coming online with another 250 megawatts of coal-fired power. We have to stop that. You can't do that and expect to win this battle. So we've got to get those countries and help those countries to be able to move more rapidly to meet the demand. You can do it. There are vast arrays of solar, which are much more powerful than they used to be, much more efficient panels, costs coming down constantly. I'm told that 100 miles by 100 square miles of area in the desert could provide for certain hours of the peak demand of the United States of America as a whole. But part of the problem is we don't have a grid in America. We can't transfer renewable power from one part of the country to another because we have a great big gaping hole in the middle of the country. So you have the East Coast grid, the West Coast grid, you have a line from Chicago across the north, and then this great belly of America open where we have all kinds of problems of cross-state boundaries and preemption and so forth. We've got to streamline that, build a grid so we can have an efficient distribution of energy in our country. These are the big ticket items. Industry's got to transition, but those are the biggest. Transportation, the single biggest thing we can do in transportation is hold on to the CAFE standards and even raise them if we can. That could obviate all kinds of other tensions in the thing.
We're a little tight on time. This has been a spectacular...
My apology, I went a little long and I apologize.
No, but we loved it. So, it was great. This has been a spectacular kickoff. I'm very grateful to you for coming. We'd love to see you back here again at USC. Thank you. And I'm very grateful to Dean Miller, to Andrew Littlefair, to the Wrigley Institute, to the Schwarzenegger Institute. We're going to have a terrific program today. We're going to head over to Town and Gown, where our first panel will begin at about 10:30. Please get there as fast as you can. If you haven't registered, the room may be full. If that happens, then you can follow the live stream on Facebook. Thank you.
By the way, can I again congratulate you? Guys have a great day ahead of you. I've looked at all the panels. It's fabulous. I'm sure you're going to come up with great ideas, and I hope we'll all share them and work on them. Thank you.
Thank you all.